Welcome to a bonus episode of the Holy Heroes podcast. Make sure you subscribe for more weekly fun and other bonus episodes just like this.
All right, I want to welcome Caitlin Bootsma to the Holy Heroes podcast. Caitlin is here today to talk all about going on pilgrimage as a family, even if you have little kids. So, Caitlin, thank you so much for coming, and I would love to hear about your recent trips as a family to visit all the holy places, even with little kids in tow.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So I am a wife. I'm a mother of 5 kids, and they range from 12 to 1. So we definitely have you covered as far as traveling with different ages. We've been, we counted, maybe to six countries in the last 3 or 4 months. So all these kind of travel tips and going, yes, it's been a lot actually. So we've been home about a week. So I'm starting to adjust to being back in Virginia, which is where we live.
Yeah, I feel like that has to be such a crazy adventure and one that your kids are absolutely not going to forget anytime soon. So what are some of your favorite places that you guys did go as a family on pilgrimage?
So I'm sure that everybody says this, but we did go to Rome during Holy Week this year. And that was amazing for a couple of reasons. But one of them is that I went to graduate school in Italy, right at one of the Vatican schools. And it's also where my husband and I met. So we had the kind of combined experience of getting to go to all these holy sites with our kids, but also to show them where we went on our first date and just kind of our life as young adults before they came around. But the combination of that made it a really special pilgrimage experience for us.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So a lot of what we did was planned, but some of it, you just was kind of spontaneous, which was really neat. I'm thinking particularly of we didn't get great seats for Palm Sunday Mass outside of St. Peter's, but in the end, our great seats are not great seats. We didn't even have chairs. We're right where Pope Francis passed by. So we ended up being only 4 feet away from the Pope. And we just kind of anticipated that. Lots of special memories like that.
So you are traveling with 5 kids and of various ages. What are some of kind of your best tips and tricks that you would recommend for families who want to maybe try like an adventurous pilgrimage with their big family?
So I think one of the big things is to plan together ahead of time, because I think involving the kids in the process, especially the older ones, but the younger ones too, can really help them feel like it's not mom and dad dragging us to these places, but it's something that we're experiencing together. So some things that we did were I got books for my various ages of kids. One about a dog who travels through Rome, or something about St. Stephen of Hungary, because we spent the majority of our time, about 7 weeks in Budapest, for my older ones. And we really started to think together about like what is really important to us that we want to see, maybe from my 12-year-old who tends to be really into history. He really could tell you, oh, yes, I want to see all these sites in ancient Rome. I'm interested in going to the catacombs. Where my 5-year-old is saying something like, well, I want to eat gelati. That's like ice cream, right? So we noted them all down, and we had like priorities as a family, not just mom and dad. But yeah. I think another thing that I really enjoyed this was trying to make the trip unique to each of my kids. And so one of the wonderful things, of course, is Catholics, they have patron saints, whether it's in their name or just someone that we've sort of entrusted them to. And we had some special opportunities to kind of connect our pilgrimages to their patron saint. Really obvious one, of course, would be we have a Peter, goes by Pete. And first thing we did was go to the Vatican and talk about, like, this is St. Peter's, and this is why we named you after him. Or I took my 5-year-old to just her and I to a Divine Mercy Church, which is a really special devotion to me, and got to explain one-on-one why I love that phrase, Jesus, I trust in you, and sort of pass that on to her. So I feel like our pilgrimage was really specific to the Bootsma family, where somebody else's might have looked different.
Did you do any pre-jet setting off to Europe? Did you try any small local pilgrimage or just smaller trips to kind of prep your kids for this big experience?
I would totally recommend that. I think getting a couple things. I mean, one, the practical side of this is what it's like to walk, walk a good distance, because almost anywhere that you go, you're going to end up walking, right? So we definitely tried to do that, take longer hikes. We were in Richmond, Virginia, which is about 2 hours from Washington, D.C. So we did go to the National Shrine, the Basilica, which was a great pilgrimage experience. And actually, I recommend that you don't have to go to Europe or Honduras, where we just were, to have any sort of, family trip. I mean, there are wonderful things closer by. And so, yeah, I think both practicing carrying things, we've definitely worked on that because we have 7 people in our family. There was no way that we could carry everyone's bags. So we talked about some of those practical things, both for traveling, which I know is a huge, probably the most intimidating factor for parents of young kids. Like, okay, this is what it's going to look like. Everybody is going to have a day pack. Everyone is responsible for their day pack, but practice taking it places. What can you fit in it? What are you, willing to leave behind, and what are you willing to take? And even things like, okay, we know that at some point during our travels, our little ones are going to get tired, and both mom and dad's arms are going to be full, which means the biggest kids maybe need to take an extra hand with the bag or the stroller. And so sort of thinking out some of those things, if we had to test them, for example, we bought a new stroller because we wanted one that fit our exact needs. We knew that we wanted to have something that both went over European city streets really well and like cobblestones, but also folded up well into metros. And so that's something that my 10-year-old, my second, is a lot better than I am with figuring out how things work. And I can never get that darn stroller to work. But it became Pete's job. We were in a hurry and we had to catch a train. Pete collapsed the stroller.
That's really handy.
Yeah. I think, too, it is neat because you see, as just like with traveling with adults, you see people's strengths and weaknesses, right? So my oldest likes guidebooks a lot. And it was very easy to just hand him, say we went to Vienna just on a side trip from Hungary, and just say, okay, Gus, you read up on this and tell us tell us where we should go. And he was able to do it, and really fill us in, or we let the 5-year-old sort of pick what the fun thing of the day was often, because she was the one whose legs would get tired. And it was just neat to see what they would pick, and then looking back, what their favorite things were, which sometimes you'd expect it, but sometimes they kind of surprise you.
Yeah, I loved when you mentioned the National Basilica in D.C. as a great pilgrimage, because I do think sometimes it's easy, especially as Catholics, we all just think oh, you have to go to Rome to have a pilgrimage, or the Camino. Do you have any other domestic places in the United States that your family has enjoyed going on pilgrimage to? I know my family is going to the Our Lady of La Leche shrine up in St. Augustine, Florida. At the end of the month. So I grew up going back there again in a few weeks. But I'm trying to think of any other ones in case people are listening to this and looking for ideas of where they could bring their kids, maybe in their own state or just a few states away.
Yeah, I think that there are so many. And I think I would preface that by saying, too, that when I was younger and I traveled as a single person, one of the things that I started doing when I would come into a new city, because I liked to travel a lot back then, too, was always go to the cathedrals first, if I could, because I would kind of dedicate my trip, to my faith. And that's something that I think I've been able to carry into family life, so there are definitely places that I can think of and I'll mention, but I think also any cathedral, any holy site is a good place to start. So even if it's in your own city, right, visiting the local cathedral and making an event of it and deciding that you're going to even pray just a decade of a rosary, right? And look and really truly spend time looking around and getting ice cream afterwards. That counts, especially, with little kids. Some other places that we have done, the California missions are really neat. My husband went to college out there, and so like seeing where St. Junipero Serra, I'm probably not saying that correctly, was, and kind of how the faith spread out there in the mission territory is something we really enjoyed seeing. I'm thinking about St. Louis's cathedral, which has like the most mosaics in the world outside of Rome. It's just stunning, absolutely stunning. I had my 6-year-old with me. My sister lives there, but we visited and we really asked that she take us there, and they were just so. My little girl was just blown away. I mean, obviously things that right near where I grew up, the American saints. So I grew up in Maryland, and the St. Elizabeth Antietam Shrine. We've always been kind of lucky to have that. And that's actually really neat for kids. We used to go on field trips there because you're able to kind of walk through the different sites where she was. And just to make a great experience, to read a child-level biography about St. Elizabeth Antietam and then to actually visit. I think just kind of combining learning and experiencing is a huge gift for kids and something that will really stick with them.
Yeah, and I think the other really interesting thing about the Elizabeth Antietam Shrine that I don't know if a lot of people realize, but it also incorporates a lot of like American history, because that is right where several battles were fought during the Civil War. And I don't know if you know this, you probably do because you've been there, but Elizabeth Ann sisters were given like medals for caring for wounded soldiers and going out on the battlefield to like.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I can't remember. I believe it's at least 2 of her sisters of her order have like military medals for their service because they just went and ministered to all of these wounded and dying men.
I think it's so important to see that connection between faith and history, and it makes us realize that like our faith has been inspiring people to virtue and holy lives throughout the history of our country, since the coming of Christ, right? We had this kind of cool experience for me when we were in Hungary, where I went to college in Texas, in Dallas, and there were an order of Cistercians, which are a branch of Trappists. They were from Hungary, and they had fled from the communist regime. And I had always heard this, and my faith was really formed by them. And then, but then when I was in Hungary, we were driving through the countryside, and suddenly I saw the name of a town, and I said, that's where they're from. That's like where, the Cistercians from Dallas are from. And my kids were all just done, which maybe is a good time to mention not packing too much in, because I knew they were not going to traipse around this monastery with me. There was no way. And so my husband was like, no, you have to see it, right? I mean, when are you next going to be in the middle of Hungary, nowhere near a major city? And so he drove around it. He dropped me off and he circled around the town while I had a chance to pray and look around myself. And, my kids, they missed that one, but they knew it was important to me. But I think like even just knowing their story from when I was in college meant that I understood a lot more of what it was like to be in communist era in Europe, and that sort of oppression, and what it meant to live your faith out boldly, and I think that we see the same thing with martyrs in America in the early history, and just saints throughout our history and throughout all the different places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really think there should be an exerted effort when studying history with Catholic kids to include the appropriate saints during that time period, because I just think that's such an interesting way to look at history and to kind of see how people still lived holy lives. I think about my brother when he was in college. He was at the Air Force Academy, so like a federal military academy. He was a history major, and he did this whole project while he was there as a junior on propaganda in newspapers during the Cristero War in Mexico. And his whole focus, like his case study, was the martyrdom of Miguel Pro. And he was like, I didn't talk about him like he was a saint. I just said he was a really famous priest who was killed during this. And, I wasn't writing this in a theology class. I was writing this in a history class. And he said, his professor, and he had to give his whole presentation afterwards, his professor and his fellow students were like so impressed that they had never heard about the Cristero War in Mexico. And he was like, yeah, why do you think that is? Like, think about that. Why this war and this, government regime that really persecuted the Catholic Church, like you were never told about any of this in your history books.
Yeah, it like shines a light on the truth. I completely agree. And I think it's been neat with my older kids, particularly, sort of that preteen age where they're really into history, but also we're able to talk about the faith and saints. And they make all of those sort of connections. And also are able to say, like, yeah, this is the way that things really were. This is why, and actually, too, why like the faith is so important, right? Because they understand all these, the persecutions, the wars, the conflicts, and like what's the thing that holds constant? It's the truth and people living for the truth and living for Christ.
Well, I know we're switching gears a little bit, but I did want to give you a chance to talk about your book, Detective Thomas and the Biggest Question. And I feel like this is a good lead-in because this is for kind of the preteen age kids who have a lot of big questions about God. So can you just tell a little bit about what this book is and kind of what made you write a book like this?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So Detective Thomas and the Biggest Question, I'll tell you how it came about first, just because I think some people can relate to this. So my oldest son, when he was, some years ago now, so maybe he was about 7, we were sitting around the dinner table and we said grace, and he looked at me and said, Mom, how do we know that God exists? Like, what if he doesn't? And he was kind of testing me a little bit, right? And for a second I thought, oh no, my son doesn't believe in God, and then I kind of got a hold of myself and said, no, he's asking a really reasonable question. Right, like that he has learned about God, but he wants to know why. Like, why does that make sense? And so we sat there and we talked about the reasons that we can know from reason that there is a God, and he understood them. And I thought more and more about this, and I thought, we don't. There is a little bit of a gap, I think, where we teach kids what we believe, but not always why we believe, and we know from various studies that kids are losing their faith younger and younger. And I think like our faith has the fullness of truth. And part of that truth is reason, right? And the ability to use our minds to understand this incredible faith that we've been given. And so I thought, if it's possible with my son kind of to relate the biggest truth, it's possible with other kids too. And I've long been a writer. Before this, I've mostly written for adults and nonfiction. But I was thinking about it, and I decided I was going to write a fiction about an inquisitive boy, a young detective. I love some of those old detective stories like Nancy Drew, Encyclopedia Brown, the newer ones like Nate the Great.
It's very like these Encyclopedia Brown-esque. I was about to say that. And I
so there's this
The Great Brain, those sort of books.
Ooh, I don't think I've read that one. It's a fun genre, right? And like I think at least I did it as a kid. I like it because they give credit to kids, right? Like kids are smart and kids are curious, and that's like Thomas. So Thomas is an amateur detective, and he comes up with largely the same question as my son, which is like, gosh, I go to church and I believe in God, but does it really make sense? And how can we know this? And so the story follows along with Thomas and also his somewhat goofy but smart brother, Charlie, who is my boy's favorite character, and how he actually follows clues. And the clues come from a supernatural helper, which I won't give that away, but he starts to get clues and he works through them in his day and starts to realize, like, yes, there's something to this. Like, we can know that there's God. That's like the way that the world was created. When we look at the world around us, we know that it makes sense that someone created it. And so we're actually following some, somewhat complicated theology, but it's distilled in a way that like kids understand and they can work alongside. We have like these detective lab parts in the book where they can kind of work out the mysteries for themselves. And so my hope is that by the end of the book, it's been enjoyable. I think Thomas is an enjoyable character, as are some of the others, but they've also really worked it through what is, in fact, the biggest question, right? Which is, does God exist? How can we know that? And so I've really enjoyed, it's been just a privilege for me to have kids come up to me, especially in my local parish. I see that people read it all over the place, but you just say, I really liked Thomas, or I really liked his friend. And, I'll ask them, like, did you solve the mystery? And they'll say, yeah, I did. And so that's just been a huge joy for me.
Yeah, I just have to think it's so wonderful that you wrote this book, because I can only imagine if my daughter at 7 asked me that question, I can now say, oh, well, here's a book that we can read together that she can actually understand and that can actually answer this question, because that's a really intimidating question for parents to have to answer on their own.
Yeah, I actually, I say this kind of frequently to parents, that it's not a bad read for adults either, because it never hurts to kind of be refreshed, or even like to be able to put to words something that you already know, because I think most practicing Catholics understand that it's reasonable to believe in God, but, to be able to have that language, especially at a level that you can communicate with your kids, can be really, really helpful. And so, yeah, I think that I was thinking maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 as sort of a target age for a reader. But I've also heard of kids younger than that even reading it with their parents and getting a lot out of it. And so I definitely think it sparks a lot of conversation as well about faith with kids and their parents, and sort of allows there to be that space for questions, which I think is important too. Like, that we pass on the faith, but we also allow kids to ask questions and to wonder, and then, more thoroughly make the faith their own.
Yeah, I am just so glad that this book exists, because, I have a 3-year-old, but I am excited for this to be on her shelf when she's, able to read and a little older, because I really do think this is an incredibly helpful way to have kids reason through their faith, and also just introduce them to the concept that our faith is reasonable. And I think that as a statement is not something that many people realize, practicing Catholic or not. Like, we have a reasonable faith.
Yeah. I'm so passionate about that. And so you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as my motivation for writing these sort of things. I have a different book for younger kids coming out on St. Edith Stein. I just have to mention, because one of the reasons that I love her, like, she is a philosopher and a very smart woman, and a woman who converted to Catholicism and became a nun, and then ultimately lost her life during the Holocaust. But there's no way that you can look at a saint like Edith and say faith is somehow opposed to reason, right? Like, she's a brilliant mind. And so it's like you were talking about propaganda. And I think that there's this widespread propaganda in our country and our society that faith is opposed to reason. And we know that it's just not true.
Yeah. Yes. I think reconciling the fact that faith and science are compatible is definitely something that parenting in this day and age, you really need to seek out those resources, because, it's interesting to see how that propaganda kind of comes out both in secular society, kind of saying, I think of my friends in college, graduate degrees in genetics and things like that, who were told by professors, like, you can't be a Christian and do this. This is just incompatible with any Christian belief you could have. You can't be a true scientist and be a Christian. And then I think about kind of the flip side of that, where I'm starting to see kind of this interesting trend of, like, people, Catholics and Christians alike, who are saying, like, yes, that is true. Like, we need to reject science and the study of science because it's incompatible with our faith. And I just think doing everything we can to provide resources to our kids when they're young to show them that really isn't the case. And while it might kind of be a lonely road to hold both together, it still is very possible. And there are honestly a lot of Catholics, saints and not, who are scientists and have made amazing scientific discoveries. So, never want to forget that. Yeah. And
that we need our kids to become these people, right? Like, that bring faith and reason together in the world. Like, their vocation is needed, whether it's a scientist or a doctor or an ethicist or a writer.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's very hopeful to see, parents like you and like us and lots of others that I know saying like these things need to work together, and they do, and that there are answers to your questions, right? So if you look deep enough in the faith, there's so many wonderful documents about that as well, like how faith works with science. And as my son says, I'll give him some credit. He goes, well, God created science. It's like, that is true.
Yeah.
He's like, science is real, but God created reality.
Yes. Well, I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for coming on today. And I'm going to make sure that your book, Detective Thomas and the Biggest Question, is linked in the show notes so that any parent listening to this can get it for their kids.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I just encourage everybody to keep letting their kids ask questions.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. I love that we got to talk today.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Holy Heroes Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the Holy Heroes Podcast for more weekly fun and special bonus episodes. You can also go to holyheroesfund.com for printables, free resources, and so many more things to help bring the joy of the faith to your family.